Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to another CaSTCo webinar. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Ella, Project Officer at the Rivers Trust and part of the project management team on the Catchment Systems Thinking Cooperative project. Today we'll be hearing from Michael Pocock, Dr. Michael Pocock, who's an ecologist at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. Michael will be taking us through his research covering the benefits of citizen science for wellbeing and nature connection, before also discussing the DECIDE tool, which is a mapping software that UKCEH has developed to help target citizen scientists where there's the greatest need for terrestrial ecology data. So before I hand over to Michael, we've got a few housekeeping points to bear in mind. Please note that this webinar is recorded and will be available to rewatch afterwards. So for the benefit of everyone's audio, please keep your mic muted when you're not talking. At the end of Michael's presentation, we'll have some time for a Q&A, and we're testing out the new Q&A function on Teams. So please submit your questions there and feel free to upvote any questions that you'd particularly like Michael to answer. We've got a hard stop at 2:30, so we can make sure to answer as many questions as we can. And you can also share your comments in the chat as well. So without further ado, let's get started, and I'll hand over to you, Michael.
Okay, thank you very much. I will share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see that all fine. So thank you very much, Ella, for that introduction. As she said, I work at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. Now, I must admit, an ecologist more than a hydrologist. I'm particularly interested in citizen science, the use of citizen science. So all the way from running citizen science projects and innovating, using new technologies within citizen science, through to using the data for science and scientific research. And I'm going to talk to you today about two particular projects that I've been involved in over the past couple of years. One is, I'm actually going to do them the other way around to the way in which they're written on the slide, but one is about wellbeing impacts and the other one is about the DECIDE tool. So this idea of targeted recording. Now, if you are here and you are obviously you're here being particularly interested in rivers, so you might be a bit disappointed by the fact that many of my examples are going to be based around butterflies and butterfly recording and things like that. But we will go on to make the links with CaSTCo. And I've been involved in CaSTCo for most of the time that the project has been running. And it's been a real privilege and a joy to be able to see the excellence of the citizen science and the citizen science thinking that is going on within CaSTCo. And so to be able to reflect on some of the differences and some of the opportunities that there comes from thinking about citizen science across these different domains. So I said that I work at UKCEH. Within that, I work within the Biological Record Centre, and we've got actually a 60-year history now of supporting people making records of wildlife. So covering everything apart from marine and organisms and birds. So we support a wide range of volunteer run or often volunteer run organisations, recording species right across the tree of life, from plants, wide range of invertebrates, through to fish and bats and things like this. And we do this particularly through structured recording schemes. And so these are the sorts of schemes where people will go out. Typically they will go out to the same location time after time after time and get really good high quality data on butterflies or plants or whatever it might be. And there are some real similarities, I think, with some of the higher tier, as we describe it, citizen science that goes on in freshwater there. And from that, we're able to develop indicators of change in biodiversity. And then the other area that we're looking at is looking at these much more opportunistic recording. And we can get tens of thousands of recorders being involved in using tools such as iRecord for species recording. And millions upon millions of records come through that. We've been developing these sorts of tools with the use of AI to support image recognition and help verify and validate some of the data there. So all of this is really exciting. We all know, I'm sure, and we know it within rivers probably even better than much of the terrestrial ecology and biodiversity, that volunteer collected biodiversity data is this really crucial component of environmental monitoring. People like the UN and various other international organisations recognises that data from professionals, data from sensors in the field and from remote sensing from satellites, and also data from volunteers through citizen science are key pillars on which we can monitor the state of the environment. And that's great, but as well as benefiting science, the citizen science that we do also benefits the people. And once again, clearly this is really obvious, I think, within the case of monitoring in fresh waters, that people have this sense of connection, a sense of place, a sense of agency that comes with collecting data and using this very much in a way to try and cause change and lead to the increased health of our fresh waters. Clearly, that is something that is incredibly timely and very much in the news. So one of the challenges with the unstructured, the opportunistic recording that people get involved in is that people can be involved wherever they choose. And so if you use iRecord or if you a range of different other projects, including the Big River Watch, people can go wherever they want and make these records. And that's great because people get that agency, they get that choice as to where they go. But one of the challenges with that is that it leads to this really profound spatial unevenness in records, both at large scales and at small scales. So the map is a contorted map with the places which are inflated, showing the places where we get most biodiversity records. And you can see that Scotland and Wales are vastly underrepresented in the number of records that we get. But on the right is the map of records from Big River Watch from just north of London. And you can see that there are some catchments which have basically no records and others which seem to be fairly well recorded. And so this can be really problematic, both in terms of our overall understanding of biodiversity or understanding water quality. But it can also be really important in terms of when we do reporting to take account of this so that we avoid bias within our results. But when we do good statistical analyses of these sorts of data, what that means is that we do have really good information on large scale trends for reporting. And so that's really positive. So we can say something that's happening about the state of our pollinators or plants or butterflies or whatever. And we can also use those records where we've got records for individual sites for that site level assessment. So that's really positive as well. However, when it comes to the data users, typically decision makers, what they lack is comprehensive and fine scale maps for natural capital decision making. So there are people, it might be within river catchments or it might be within local authorities thinking about the local nature recovery partnerships and all that's going on there within England at least. People need information that's more local than just saying our rivers are doing okay or our butterflies are doing badly or whatever it might be. Actually, to be able to make those spatial decisions, it's really important. And some work that we did within the Decide project, which I'll talk about in detail in a bit later on, what we found was that recorders said that they really lack those tools to guide their recording. People wanted to go out and make records that were valuable, that would be valuable for data users, but they just didn't have the guidance to know where to go. So that led us to this premise that all records are valuable. Bring them on. It's great to have all the data that we can. But we don't simply need more records. We need more informative records. So how do you choose where or when to record, or even what to record in some cases? One really simple approach that we've done is to develop these targeting revisits maps. And these have been developed for a range of different taxa, grasshoppers, ground beetles, and a few other things. And we gave people these maps with really simple color scheme on them, with the simple message that we would like people to visit and make records of wildlife in the pink squares. And if you do that and you submit the records, then you turn them green. They become so-called well recorded. And people have found this a really, really positive tool, because it then allows them to say, well, actually, do I want to visit the pink squares? Many people have said, actually, they want to visit the blank squares, and they can see where there's been no records in the past. The pink squares where there's been records from only 1 year in the past, or the green squares where there have been records in more than 1 year in the past. So people can click on the squares and they can get some information about what's been recorded and when it's been recorded as well. So we did some surveys with people saying, well, look, tools like this, how important is it? How much does it influence the way that you record? And broadly, what we found was that people said it was really likely to influence them. So giving people this sort of feedback before they go out and make their records, it's really likely to influence them. How much? Well, what they said was mostly it's not going to influence them a lot. They're still going to keep going to the places that they like going to, places which they've got into the habit of going to, where they walk the dog or whatever it might be. But people were saying that it would influence them for some of the time. And one of the key things, this is a quote from one of the participants, was that they said that being able to see how impactful their recording can be and directing them to where recording can have the greatest impact is immensely powerful and motivating. And I think that is really important then, because it demonstrates the agency which we can give people with good feedback using all the technology that we've got. That agency that people have in order to say, I can make my time count. I can make my recording count. And that feels really important. Now, within rivers, I am aware that so many people will be doing that and recording for that reason already. And I think it's valuable, or there's the opportunity within CaSTCo for us to be able to reflect and say, well, is there something that we can build in a way that's like this to give people that really strong feedback, to not always just get data from the places that we've always got it from in the past, but potentially if we would particularly like records in new places. So this leads on to the Decide project, which was a bit more of an in-depth approach of exploring this a bit further on. And this was funded by the Natural Environment Research Council, finished a year or so ago. And so we were particularly, as I said, apologies for those of you who love rivers, but we were interested in the butterflies and the moths. And so you've got all these records from citizen scientists going into digital data, and we have millions of records in these digital databases. And from these, we can do modelling. So we were interested in doing that fine scale, spatially comprehensive modelling, which had uncertainty as well. This typically was like distribution maps across the country. But the key thing about Decide was that we built in this idea of a digital twin, if you like, or citizen science adaptive sampling, because we fed the results from the models, in particular the uncertainty, back to the recorders to help direct them where to go. So first of all, what we wanted to do was really deeply understand what motivated people and how nudgeable they might be. So we did a range of interviews with representative recorders, and what they said was they really wanted to make their recording count. So it suggested that they were willing to be nudged in terms of their recording behaviour. They had a really high level of trust in organisations like ours, and I'm sure Rivers Trusts as well would be in very much the same situation, but people trusted. So we didn't need to, they said we didn't need to try and or have to explain in great detail or go through the mathematical equations or anything like that. No, they just said, give me a map and say where you want records, and I can treat that as an invitation. I might accept it and go where you'd like me to. I might not accept it, and I'll carry on recording in the places that I can. But basically, I trust you when you say you need records there. And the other thing was that people said that there were these intrinsic motivations. So stuff like nature connectedness, a sense of place, all sorts of things like that. So for some people, at least some of the time, that will indicate that actually they're not able to be nudged. They might be resistant to that in some sort of way. So that led us to thinking about these tools for persuasive communication. And as we sketched out and explored ideas, what we sought to do was to design these tools with the user first. So it wasn't simply about what do we want to get, what do we as scientists need to get, we need to design the app that gets the data that we need. No, what we said is that we need to design the apps and the tools that are relevant, provide relevant information to people, provide it in a really accessible form, to make it really actionable so people aren't left hanging wondering what they're supposed to do with it, but it's a really clear call to action, and throughout make it appealing and attractive and beautiful. And you don't need to read the detail along this roadmap, but we adopted a different approach to the typical approach that certainly scientists adopt. So typically I would go around and I'd think my thoughts and come up with something that I thought was wonderful, present it then to people, and possibly get very sad and upset when people don't immediately love it. So within this project, what we did is we adopted this fail fast design approach. And so through a range of different approaches and different interventions with potential users, we went through all these stages really quickly, developing rapid or early prototypes, and doing it in an incremental way. So building this tool with people being involved in different stages in different ways throughout that whole process. And that we found really important. So I knew roughly what I thought, where we should be going to and where we should be aiming for. But this whole process continuously shaped the way in which we were developing that. And that just showed how important it was to get that feedback. So in terms of some of the technicalities, what did we do? Well, we took a whole load of environmental data, mostly from satellites, combined it with some of the presence absence data that we had on different butterfly species, and then did a whole load of mathematical modelling and came up with a predicted distribution and uncertainty. And what therefore we could see within these outputs is that we could see that there were places where there was greater uncertainty. So that suggested that more records in those places could help improve the models. And so we took that and we said, okay, so where are the models of species distribution least confident? And we combined that across all the species that we were interested in. We then basically masked that layer by taking away where the observations have already been made. So we took the assumption that if people have been to a particular site recording butterflies in the past, they may well go there in the future. But if nobody has been to a place in the past and it is a high priority for recording, we should really focus people's attention on those. So we went through that workflow with these millions of records across the millions of hectares. Each of this was done at a hectare scale across Great Britain, and ran that for for all of the butterflies and moths. So we developed this tool, which you can go and you can have an explore if you would like. So the questions were simple: that do you want to go and discover new places to record wildlife? The Decide tool shows those places with the highest priority for recording. You can choose a location to visit and then record all the species with existing apps and websites. And I think I can imagine something very similar working within CaSTCo and within our projects and our activities, being able to nudge and suggest to people where they might be interested in going, and also what records they might be interested in taking. Anyway, so this is what the tool looks like. So we've got the colours. In the co-design process, people got very stuck on liking and disliking particular types of colours. And that was really interesting how stuck people seemed to be until we got colours that they liked. And then they were able to interact and really engage with the rest of the tool. You can press a button and you can get specific suggestions. So you can either explore this and just choose to go where you want, or you can get recommendations for places which are high priority for recording and which are in accessible places. So we included data layers on the accessibility of different locations, whether there was public access or not. And all of this data was updated in real time from iRecord. You can click on any one of those squares or any one of those pins. You can get further information as to why we thought that was a high priority recording square, why that was, and what people might expect from going there as well. So all of this was very much designed with the user in mind in order to improve the data that we got. We got many people using it a lot of time, and the interesting thing for me was that we had nearly 4 minutes per interaction, so people when they got on were really exploring this tool, which I think was really positive. So the interesting question you might be asking is saying, well, that's all very well in theory, but does it actually have any practical implications? And the answer is yes. So just to talk you through this, what we did is, rather than dealing with what people were really doing, we created simulations. And so we had within the computer, we had virtual butterflies across the virtual landscape being sampled by virtual citizen scientists. And then we tested the impact of these different targeting strategies. So I've shown just 3 of them here. One is just business as usual, record where you want. The second one is gap filling, record in the places where we haven't had records in the past. And the third one was what I call a sort of intelligent gap filling. And in this case, it was what I described earlier. And what's shown in the graph at the bottom is the number of models. So we ran it many times, but the number of models which had a greater than 1% improvement in the fit of the models. And so what we found was that whether 1 or 10 or 50% did the particular activity, well, as you would expect, business as usual has no effect. But if you go for gap filling, then by the time you've got 50% of people doing gap filling, then actually that begins to make quite a big difference in terms of the improvements in the models. But if you do it in a more intelligent way, as shown on the right, then you get even better improvement. But the thing that was really striking for me was if you only had 1% of uptake, only 1% of recording visits were according to gap filling or the intelligent gap filling. Well, for gap filling, it didn't really have much impact. But as soon as you switch to doing this in an intelligent way, thinking about where the gaps are most important, even only 1% had a big impact. So just to emphasize that, people can 99% of the time be doing recording in their own way. And for the example that we were thinking of and exploring here, just one person in 100 going off and doing something different can make a difference to our models. Just shows the power that we can have from doing this. And just finishing the section on Decide, we provided personalised feedback to people, and we had 800 people sign up for weekly data stories about their butterfly recording. And we designed them different data stories to appeal to different motivations. And so you've got the 4 examples on the right there, and people were encouraged with a great find that they've had, then encouraged to go looking for more. People giving indications as to where to go to do that extra mile type of recording. People were thinking about, or encouraged to think about, what together all of the recording community have done. And the other one was a bit more competitive. How's your impact compared to other people? And the interesting thing is that all of these had some sort of benefit, but particularly the ones that were personalized, the ones which are really targeted to you and your recording over the past few weeks. Those are the ones which had the greatest impact. And in particular, actually, those which had that slight competitive edge seemed to be positive, particularly positive. So when it comes to CaSTCo and this whole idea of, do you go recording in a river? And if you do go recording, what do you do? I think there's so much more potential for us to be thinking about using some of the technologies for feedback to help guide people where to make, or how, well, to guide people in making records. So that could be about the where to go, and that could be about filling gaps, or it could be about intelligently filling gaps. It could be about when to go as well. And that, I think the whole idea of are we particularly interested in people going out and recording after major rainfall events, or in particular circumstances? Can we develop the sorts of tools, apps, or whatever it might be, that provide those sorts of nudges to people to invite them to go and record at times when we would particularly like them to? And also what and how to record. So it might be that actually in one particular location, recording phosphate or nitrate might be particularly important. In another location, or for another individual, it might be that recording flow rate is particularly important, or going off and looking for invertebrates, or whatever it might be. And I think there's so much more potential that we've got of using technologies in these really smart ways about making our science nav, our citizen science, so much more personalised to the individual experience of people. So thinking about people, because it's not simply about using people as sources of data and going out and collecting data, but some of these questions, as we said earlier, about people having that sense of care and stewardship and wanting a sense of agency, in the case of CaSTCo, about their rivers, about river water quality. So this leads on to some work that we did thinking about nature connectedness and well-being. So we know that being in nature makes people happy, and people say that. They've said that within the People in Nature survey, which Natural England ran. This was a particular question during COVID times. We also know that time in nature benefits well-being. Been a few different studies showing that 30 minutes per day or 120 minutes per week have demonstrable impacts on people's well-being, measures of well-being. But the interesting thing that people have begun to explore further is that it's the quality of time, not just the amount of time that people spend in nature. So hours spent out walking with earphones on, listening to music or whatever, probably won't have as much impact as a few minutes with that real intentional engagement with nature. And so one of the ways to think about this is a colleague of mine from the University of Derby, who was working with me on this particular project. He and others have worked on the 5 pathways to nature connection, which I think is a really helpful way for thinking about this idea of nature connectedness. So you can see there that they found that using senses, all the senses, not just sight, is important. Seeking and appreciating the beauty of the natural world. It doesn't necessarily have to mean amazingly beautiful landscapes, the sorts of incredible natural beauty, but just finding beauty where it is. Emotion, so actually noticing and welcoming those feelings that you have while being in nature. And I think that's particularly useful when thinking about citizen science, when people can be going, no, must be doing this all in a scientific way. Well, yes, of course we want that, but equally you can have those feelings of happiness or sadness or contentment or peacefulness or whatever it might be as well. Meaning, so thinking about that sense of meaning as you connect with nature, and compassion as well. And one of the particular ways in which environmental psychologists have thought about building on these pathways to nature connectedness is by noticing 3 good things in nature and actually writing them down. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to actually test this experiment. And so we did a randomized controlled trial of the impact of different nature-based citizen science on well-being and nature connectedness. So this ran during the period of lockdown, so that first summer of 2020. And what we did was we had, I'll just go back. So we had over 1,000 people sign up to take part. Over 500 people completed all the surveys and all the tasks that we asked them to. And each person was given 1 activity to do, and we asked them to do it ideally 5 times over the next week. And it was either citizen science or a noticing nature activity or a combination of the both. We had control groups in there as well who did nothing particular. So what we found was any activity that people did, any of these nature-based activities, they were good for people. So when you do the psychological measurements of happiness, satisfaction with life and things like that, we found that all of them were good, which shows that citizen science as one of those interventions is beneficial. What we also did was that we were thinking about those pathways to nature connectedness. And what we found is that all the activities engaged those pathways to nature connectedness. People said that they found that taking part was meaningful, or they noticed the beauty in nature. Those people who particularly or specifically were asked to do noticing nature activities, so spend 10 minutes in nature, simply enjoying nature, reflecting on your meaning, using your senses, people found that it was calming and joyful, and those things were really, really positive. But for those people who we said, can you go out and record butterflies for 10 minutes? That really boosted compassion. So people were saying that they felt that they were helping to take care of nature in some sort of way. And what we did was that we actually brought those 2 together in one of the interventions. So we asked people to go out and record butterflies, but also to notice nature, to reflect on their emotions and that sense of meaning that they got. And that combined activity actually had strengths of both. So people had that sense of compassion, but also had that sense of boosting emotion, things like that. And that suggested that there's the real opportunity to develop better citizen science. And it was really exciting through CaSTCo working with the Rivers Trust on the Big River Watch, because with a team of people who were developing that activity before it first ran, we were being really intentional about building in some of these connections with nature connectedness as part of the activity. And to my knowledge, that's the first time that any citizen science has specifically been seeking to develop those nature connectedness as an active part of the citizen science project. So as it says there, designed both to collect the data and also to boost nature connectedness. So we know that thousands of people were involved in 23 and then have been involved in May and September 24 as well, which is absolutely superb. And in 23, 60% were new to citizen science, which is great. So we asked people to spend 10 minutes at the river and then to reflect on how that they felt and how they scored the river. And it was interesting that those people who said, yep, my river's healthy, they were saying that it was calm, they felt peaceful, they felt relaxed and happy. And then there were other people who, going to different sites, scored their river as looking unhealthy. Interestingly, they also said, so these word clouds, the size of the words reflect the frequency of the words in the responses. They also said calm and relaxed and happy and peaceful. But you can see that words like sad and disappointed, concerned and angry also come up as well. I find this really interesting that even if people can be next to unhealthy rivers, actually their engagement, or rivers that they call or think of as unhealthy, their engagement with that river, that blue space flowing through their surroundings, can lead to that calmness and peacefulness, as well as that sadness and wanting to take action. So bringing this in to land, I just wanted to reflect a little bit more on just what really this means in terms of CaSTCo and the opportunities for us. I'm sure more of this will come out in the questions, and I'm sure you've got your own thoughts as well. But I think one of the things is within CaSTCo, we've got this tiered approach to how people are involved, with tier 3 being that real regulatory quality monitoring work that goes on. And then below that, we've got the targeted monitoring. We've got professionals, highly trained volunteers doing the sort of recording that goes on. And then as we move down, we get more and more to the stuff that more people can be involved in as and when they choose. And it feels to me it's at these lower tiers that there's really great opportunity for us to come together through CaSTCo and be thinking about these opportunities for, well, if we are going to do targeted recording, like spatial targeted recording, or targeted in terms of what people do where, in order for us to get the best data and the most useful data possible, well, can we come together to be really thinking about this and to develop the sorts of tools that people can use in order to know what's going to be best to do where. And I think that the Big River Watch is a great example of how then this can link to explicitly to developing and boosting people's well-being. Right. And I just wanted to close with an example of a project which it's not part of CaSTCo, but I think it's very closely aligned, and it's been really exciting for us to be able to develop links through CaSTCo with some of the individual rivers trusts. So what on earth are those funny little strips of cardboard there? Those are actually, got one here. These things here are actually the basis of environmental DNA sampling and assessment, believe it or not. And so I noticed Andrew Singer is on the call as well. So I'm working with him and colleagues at the University of Lincoln and Cranfield University. And so the folk at Cranfield and Lincoln are going to be developing these to be used for invasive species monitoring, so that you're able to take a sample of water and then be able to detect things like mink or demon shrimp or whatever it might be. And I think this is a really great opportunity for then exploring some of these targeted monitoring types of approaches, and also potentially actually building in those thoughts about well-being and that purposefulness that people get from taking part in citizen science. So we're really excited to be engaging with some of the rivers trusts on exploring this and co-designing these tools to make them as accessible as possible. So I just wanted to close on, for those of you who are interested in some of the work that we're doing and some of the different expertise that we might be able to bring and support you with, you can visit our website at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology and see some of the guides that we've got for citizen science. Maybe that you're not, I don't know why you wouldn't be interested in pollinator monitoring, but maybe you're too interested in getting your feet wet. But nonetheless, I think that pollinator monitoring guide, actually, we developed that as a way of thinking about how we can bring best practice to actually incredibly dispersed network of people interested in doing pollinator monitoring. So the synergies are so similar with what we're seeking to do within CaSTCo, actually. And also there's the UK Environmental Observation Framework. This is a network primarily for government agencies interested in citizen science, but the resources that we produce are freely available. And keep your eyes open, because usually every year or so we have a symposium which is open to anyone. And on that note, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was really great to see the kind of scale of impact that we can have, and how nature connection can feed into that wonderful citizen science monitoring that I'm sure we're all trying to embed in further tiered frameworks and that sort of thing. I think thank you for sharing those resources as well, because we had a little request in the chat that it would be helpful to have a summary of some of the research about the links between wellbeing and nature connection, or guidance for where to look for it, from Daniel. So thank you for asking for that, Daniel, as well. And we'll be sharing these slides afterwards, so we can definitely pull those together. Looks like we've got a few questions coming into the Q&A already, so feel free, if you want to ask a question, please pop it into the Q&A, or we can also do raised hands and you can just talk to Michael directly and turn your camera on if you like. So whatever works for anyone, but I can read out Michelle's, because I think that she has had to go. If Michael, you're happy to start there. So Michelle has said, I'm interested in any specific use cases of a decide-like tool that we might be able to explore on CaSTCo. For example, SciMap Inverse can use citizen science data to constrain and calibrate catchment sediment runoff risk models. I hope that, Michael, you understand that more than I do. So is there something decide-like we could develop to show people where in their catchment monitoring data would best constrain the model, and if so, how or who could move this forward? Big question.
Yeah, so I understand the gist of it. I certainly don't understand the detail in terms of that catchment sediment runoff risk models, but yes, absolutely. So if we've got these sorts of models where we can, where we see that potentially there's greatest uncertainty spatially or temporally, there might be high levels of uncertainty, then actually being able to ground truth that with citizen science data, I think that's the sort of thing, absolutely. So as to who moves those forward, well, I guess someone who understands some of those sorts of the details of developing those sorts of risk models would be great. But equally, I think some of the approaches that we developed and that we used within Decide of having that co-design right the way through, embedded through that project, and developing the tools to be able to be, as we said, relevant, actionable, accessible. Yeah, we'd be really happy to continue discussing that.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And actually, if anyone on this call has, you know, a lot of knowledge about that sort of risk mapping and type of thing, and want to put their hat in the ring to kind of support that development within CaSTCo, just let us know, because we can see what sort of opportunities we can pull together to develop that. And similarly, Bill has popped in the chat, when do we get started on a river tool for rivers and lakes and ponds? So I think along the same lines, that would be a great application as well. Right, let's go to Luke's question. Luke, you're very welcome to ask this yourself, or I can read it out. Okay.
Yes, sorry, hello.
Thanks,
yeah,
Luke.
I can read it out to you. Thank you very much, Michael. Very interesting talk, so thank you very much for that. My question was really the data sets you've been discussing that your modeling is based off. They are, as you discussed, huge.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you'd had a little look into the impact that this style of tool would have on a smaller data set. So, for example, if a trust is only got, say, 100 volunteers, something like that, or maybe even less, is it still worth the investment of time into a tool like this, or is more basic gap filling more time effective?
Yeah, I think so. We were interested that within the Decide project, we were interested in quite a few different threads of the project, and one of them was developing these high throughput models running on supercomputers and all the rest of it, and being able to do that at scale. And so that was part of it, which is partly why we focused on this. I should acknowledge the fact that, of course, these sorts of approaches are done and have been done for a long time within rivers trusts, within biological recording. And so people have been thinking about these questions about gap filling intelligently, but haven't necessarily brought that all together. And I think this is one of the benefits, or this is, certainly one of the opportunities with Decide type of approaches, that we can do this more at scale. And I think actually there can be the opportunity of individual rivers trusts working together in partnership to be able to explore this further. And I think the other thing is, so I mentioned those targeting revisits maps where we asked people to go and visit to change a pink square to green. Well, actually, that was a much simpler way of defining where we really need records. It was simply looking at the database and saying, where have we got records from only 1 year in the past? So really simple thing to do, but also actually a really powerful thing for people to be able to say, I know not just that a project organizer is asking me to go here, that actually can be very powerful in its own right, but also I know why I'm being asked to go there and do that recording. And so there are certainly many simpler ways of taking these sorts of approaches forward. But then the other side of it, I think, that is important as well, is holding intention both the importance of that human contact. And so at the CaSTCo meeting that we had recently, all together up in Birmingham, we were talking about the importance of activity organisers and volunteer coordinators and people like that. So really, if you've got 100 or so super keen recorders who are doing amazing recording work, actually that human contact is really important. And that's great and that's valuable. There's also, on the flip side, all the opportunities that can come from engagement and use of new technologies. And I think that can also be really important and really enabling. Now, how we balance those two, I'm sure depends on particular circumstances and individual projects, but and I'm sure the future will always be both and, but possibly in a different sort of blend within different examples.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I'm just jumping to the chat here where Roger, you've said about your work in Aberdeen where you're developing green prescribing between local GPs and conservation organisations as a practical and measurable means to improve mental health. And I know that this green prescribing is definitely beginning to be applied in quite a few scenarios. I wonder, Michael, if you've got anything to say about that.
Yes, yeah, I think that sort of thing is amazing. One of the things that I've noticed that with many of the green prescribing activities is that they tend to be at a site, at a place with a group. And I think in the context of green prescribing, there are so many good reasons for that. And actually that sense of community is something that's really important. I didn't really talk much about community within my talk, but my experience and from what I've heard about doing things like river quality monitoring is that being able to do it as part of a team and go out on activities and do cleanups as well as water quality monitoring or sampling, all that sort of thing is really important. So that sense of community. One of the things that I'm interested in about citizen science is that that's all very well for the Tuesday morning that you get together with your community and do something practical for the environment. But what about Thursday afternoon, and what about the weekend when you're feeling lonely and that sort of thing? And I just wonder if it feels to me that there's an opportunity of citizen science or for citizen science when we can both demonstrate that strength of doing things in community and doing things together as part of a team, but also it provides that opportunity for those people who are going to particularly benefit from that green prescribing. It provides them with opportunities and agency to do stuff outside of the organised activities. And I'd love to explore further what those how that really works out in practice and how practicable that is. But yeah, great points, Roger.
Thanks, Michael. Going back to the Q&A area, we've had a sort of, I suppose, more of a comment from Edward Davies. I don't know, Edward, if you want to speak about this yourself. If not, I can read it out.
Yeah, no, it is just a comment. Is that I was writing and I was thinking, have I got a question in here? But I'm not sure I have. But yeah, it's just I think where citizen science has really developed and it's got a long history is through species recording and things like that, hasn't it? And I think where one of the problems that we run into with chemical water quality monitoring in particular is that you don't necessarily get that reward that you spoke of, where you identify, say, a butterfly or something like that, because that's a nice experience in itself. And then to layer on top of that, to be able to draw any reasonable conclusions from chemical data in particular, you need a reasonably long-term data set, and for that to have been collected quite consistently, and then any actions and outcomes that come as a result of that take even longer to be able to sort of see the benefits, which I think is one of the places where a lot of volunteers and effort can feel a bit disenfranchised when it feels like a year down the line that they're no further along. But I kind of finished with the point that with water quality or water health monitoring, the real benefits I see from perhaps more casual citizen scientists are through apps like, I don't know whether you've encountered either of these, but there's the Mud Spotter app, which is generally like a wet weather survey app, which doesn't rely on those two sort of things that I've just mentioned earlier, and can be quite useful for regulators in terms of finding incidents ongoing and things like that, and the EU Amber Fish Barrier app, because they just don't have those same kind of constraints as the chemical water quality. But what I've found is that a lot of people want to go out with their phosphate strip or something like that, and they want to dip it in the water and get that result, and then depending on that result, maybe sort of do a bit of saber rattling and say this is unacceptable, which makes it very difficult.
Yes, so a couple of reflections. I think some of the things like the river barriers apps and the mud spotter app, one of the tricky things can be knowing if we don't get a record, does that mean that nobody's been there, or does it mean that there isn't a problem? And actually dealing with that is a classic thing that we try and grapple with in terrestrial biodiversity, citizen science as well. Really tricky statistically to try and deal with some of those things. It might seem brilliant that we're getting loads of records from people just like that. So yeah, it is great, but it does lead to challenges as well in terms of some of the data. And I've found it fascinating just being involved in these two very similar but also quite different aspects of citizen science, the terrestrial biodiversity and the freshwater quality. And doing that compare and contrast in my mind constantly. And I think one of the things that actually you hinted at, but you didn't quite say, is that I think there's, don't shoot me down in case I'm slightly wrong here, but there's probably an easier or there's a clearer understanding of what good looks like when it comes to water quality. And with biodiversity, well, how many rare species is good? Or how many butterflies on a transect is good? It's really hard to do that. I think the challenge comes is that, yeah, you can get one misreading or you get one particular spike and suddenly, as you say, people are off saber rattling. But it changes some of the impact, I think, of the citizen science. And within terrestrial biodiversity, often actually, because something like butterfly counts will be so influenced by weather and all sorts of things that actually it might be many years and huge timescales, huge spatial scales before we can really get through to the policies which might have an impact. So actually, I mean, very rarely is stuff changing within a year. It's often multi-year. So I think, yeah, I think there's a real agency that people have with water quality monitoring that also creates risks as well. But agree with what you say about that sense of the feedback that people need.
Thanks, Michael. I think we've got time for probably one more question, so I'll go with Dominic's. Dom, I don't know if you want to say this yourself, but I can read it out if you like.
Yeah, no, happy to quickly. Hi, Ella. Hi, Michael. Thanks very much for the talk. Yeah, my point was kind of more generally just about perceptions of citizen science or citizen gathered data. And I think there's still quite a bit of skepticism in some quarters about the validity of this data. And I was just wondering, yeah, what your thoughts or ideas are around reducing that and, yeah, promoting it as a more reliable and robust source of information.
And I've got 2 minutes before Ella's going to close us off to sort out that one. It is such a big issue because I think it's both it's a perennial criticism, and it almost, I'm not suggesting that you're doing it on this account, but I think it can almost feel quite cheap, the way that people go, oh, hang on, you've said citizen science, I say unreliable. And I think that's something which I think there is so much evidence that citizen science can be used well, that I think we are, with so many case studies, we're addressing that. Maybe the most helpful thing I should say in close, though, is I've talked about citizen science as if it's one thing. It's not. Citizen science is many, many different things. And there can be citizen science that's brilliant at engaging people and rubbish at producing data that's scientifically valid. There can be citizen science that is absolutely superb and I think it's a third of the UK government biodiversity indicators are based entirely or mostly on citizen science data. So you've got stuff which is signed off by the Office for National Statistics as verified headline indicators, which comes from citizen science data. So just I suppose my closing thing would be don't put it all in one basket, but just let's all be thoughtful and let's all aspire to the very best that we can.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael. That's a great sentiment to end on. And sorry if we didn't get to your questions. We can, Michael's happy to answer some on email afterwards, so we will sort those out and get those answers to you. Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful questions. And thank you, Michael, for such an informative webinar. We'll share the recording and the slides with everyone afterwards. And if you have a particular case study, success story or learning that you'd like to share in a future CaSTCo webinar, then please do get in touch. Thank you.